For all its beauty and splendor, the wilderness can be a cruel teacher. In the sport of mountain climbing, you're attempting to attain high points in mountainous regions, mainly for the pleasure of the climb. Although the term is often loosely applied to walking up low mountains that offer only moderate difficulties, it is more properly restricted to climbing in localities where the terrain and weather conditions present such hazards that, for safety, a certain amount of previous experience will be found necessary. For the untrained, mountaineering is a dangerous pastime. Click the subscribe and like buttons. This is Outdoor Disasters. Rising above a scene rich with extraordinary wildlife, pristine lakes, and alpine terrain, the Teton Range stands as a monument to the people who fought to protect it. These are mountains of the imagination, mountains that led to the creation of Grand Teton National Park, where you can explore over 200 miles of trails, float the Snake River, and enjoy the serenity of this remarkable place. The park encompasses much of the Teton Range and most of Jackson Hole, a fertile valley just to the east of the Tetons, through which runs the Snake River. The snow-covered and glacially scoured peaks of the range, whose highest point is Grand Teton, 13,770 feet above sea level, tower some 7,000 feet above Jackson Hole. The steep, rugged mountains give way to the morainic landscape of the valley, which is dotted with glacial lakes of varying sizes. The best known of these is Jenny Lake, which lies at the base of the tallest peaks. One of the most daring stories in climbing history, the North Face rescue on the Grand Teton, is a tale that many haven't heard, but is considered one of the most legendary daring mountain climbing rescues ever. In the 1960s, mountaineering and rock climbing was still a niche sport. There weren't any rock gyms, and climbers were seen as part of a counterculture in the mountains of the United States. One of the most popular climbing destinations in the country was Grand Teton National Park. It offered dozens of technical routes, stunning scenery, and a welcoming community of alpine climbers. The north face of the Grand Teton was an intimidating route that was technical, dangerous, and on many climbers' bucket lists. It was first ascended in 1936, but it had eluded many climbers in the years following. The Grand Teton's north face is not an especially difficult technical climb by today's standards, with at least one route never exceeding a 5.8 rating, a moderate grade. Often there is snow and ice in the chimneys, a particular challenge considering the old mountain boots climbers wore in the 1960s. Many dangers when climbing the north face. You can't see the weather moving in from the southwest, where it often does in the Tetons. Storms can move in and trap climbers on the exposed face. Then there is the rockfall. The cold chimneys and ledges of the north face gather snow and ice that holds in fallen rocks. As the sun warms the face, the snow releases the rocks that rain down, gathering speed as they bounce off the mountain. It was rockfall that Gaylord Campbell said severed the rope and threw him off the mountain. Lorraine McCoy met Gaylord Campbell as part of an outdoor club at the University of Illinois, where she learned to climb. They arrived in the Tetons earlier in the summer and successfully climbed the Grand Teton by the Owen Spalding route, one of the most popular and easiest ways to the top, as well as Mount Moran, then traveled to Canada, where they climbed several peaks before returning to the Tetons. Campbell wanted to climb the north face in winter, so the summer ascent was a way for him to check out the route. Lorraine McCoy, then 21, was belaying her climbing partner Gaylord Campbell on the north face of the Grand Teton on August 22, 1967, when she heard an explosion, a loud bang of rock bouncing off rock. She was situated beneath an overhang and unable to see her partner. She tightened the rope he was attached to above, expecting a fall. But instead of feeling the rope go taut with the loading of body weight, it came back empty. The rope severed. When the rope came back to McCoy empty, she started shouting. Just below the summit, the large rock sent Campbell tumbling down the rocky face. He was injured badly. Hearing him respond, she made her way to the ledge where he called from and found him lying with bones sticking out of his lower leg. Using ice axes and webbing, she stabilized the leg and made a splint and wrapped her partner in a sleeping bag and began to cry for help. She flashed SOS with her flashlight but never saw any responses. There was no way for her to make it down the face with Campbell on her own. She waved and yelled at climbers she spotted on a snowfield on a neighboring peak. She thought, and hoped. They saw her. Then they settled in for the night. In the distance, she watched lightning flash and feared they'd be caught in a storm, exposed on the ledge, unable to move. Once it was dark, she used her flashlight to blink SOS again before the batteries died. Miraculously, lights flashed back in response. 2 climbers heard cries for help while they were climbing Mount Owen. They raced down to the Jenny Lake Ranger Station and reported to Ralph Tingy. They showed up at Tingy's ranger cabin door to report that while on Mount Owen, they'd heard cries for help from the north face. A knock that late at night almost always meant something was wrong. Ralph Tingy, just 22 years old, called out to the other rangers and began to assess the situation. Tingy drove to a scenic turnout that looked straight on at the Grand and in the distance. He saw the blinking SOS. He flashed his truck lights back in response to let them know help was on the way. At first light, Tingy used a spotting scope and saw one person up and walking around and the other lying in a sleeping bag on the second ledge of the face. No one knew yet the extent of the injuries on the mountain, but the location meant it was serious. There had never been a rescue on the north face. Tingy saw Lorraine's flashlights and responded in kind, but she was never able to make out his response. As the pair spent their first night on the Grand, she was unaware that a team of talented mountaineers was making their plan. The Tetons attracted the best climbers on the continent in the 60s, and many of them decided to make a living as rangers so they could live in or near the park. That summer, there were 4 Jenny Lake climbing rangers: Tingy, Bob Irvine, Rick Reese, and head ranger Pete Sinclair. For big jobs, the rangers sometimes called in reinforcements. Ted Wilson and Mike Ermarth both worked in the North District of the park. Both were exceptional climbers and regular partners with the climbing rangers. It just so happened that world-class mountaineers Lee Ortenberg and Bob Irvine were on the summit of the Grand and quickly descended to help the efforts. The rangers trained for and thought about different rescues. What if something happens on the slabs of Mount Moran? What if someone falls on Symmetry Spire? The big one was always the north face. It was no man's land, Wilson said. I think everyone shuddered in their own particular way. I remember a chill running down my spine. Wilson didn't have a phone in his cabin. He got news of the rescue with a knock on the door. Get your gear, Jenny Lake called. They've got a rescue on the north face. That's when I felt the chill, he said. Ortenberger and Irvine waited to meet the rest of the team on the mountain since they were already up there. It was also lucky that the weather was clear and would continue to hold for the next 3 days. When the first rescuers arrived at the ledge where Cambell lay, they saw his leg, an open fracture in the tibia, with the bones sticking out. Ranger Ted Wilson got his first look at the 2 bones sticking through the skin on Cambell's lower leg and felt a pit in his stomach. He wasn't queasy. The busted bones just made it clear what lay ahead for the rescue team. They immobilized the leg from the hip down and knew a trag sits, which is like a chair a ranger carries out, wouldn't work, despite Cambell's claim that was the way to get him down. The rescuers opted instead to put him in a litter. Upon arrival, Cambell complained their pitons were upside down. On the first night out, Gaylord spent a considerable amount of time trying to convince rescuers that he was the world's best climber and was critical of their decisions and their gear. At the time, they dismissed his rantings as coming from a badly injured person whose mind was clouded by morphine. In any case, badly needed babysitting duties were turned over to Ted Wilson. Cambell never said thanks. There was no chance of a helicopter rescue, and Cambell's injuries meant he had to be lowered on a litter to the glacier below, where a level landing pad had been carved in the snow. They decided not to take him up the mountain over the steepest part of the face with a painfully slow winch system that would increase everyone's exposure to rockfall and require multiple anchors to pendulum the litter across. Instead, they opted to go down into the unknown. The rest of the team made its way to the ledge and began to plot the lowering. The features of the north face include ledges that gave rescuers a chance to regroup and set new anchors. Those ledges, though, accumulate snow and ice, and as the day warms, the snow releases chunks of rock, periodic unexpected zings racing by, some the size of tennis balls, big enough to gravely injure anyone they hit. Bigger rocks, the size of softballs and soccer balls, are enough to remind you of your mortality. Each rockfall emits a sulfurous smell as the impact turns schist into dust with a percussive bang. "It's kind of like artillery blasts going by you," said Ermarth, who served as litter jockey, sitting with Cambell for the first lowering. "It's like being on a shooting range with people shooting at you. You don't know where it's coming from or where it's going." They set about figuring out how to lower Cambell, an arduous and painstaking process. Through a series of ropes, cables, levers, and winches, the Rangers got to work lowering the 5'11", 220-pound climber inch by precious downward inch over a 2,000-foot nearly sheer face that to anyone's knowledge hadn't been traversed before and hadn't since. He was secured in the litter and a helmet placed over his face to protect him from falling rocks and debris. Each man would take a turn descending with the litter to keep it from wandering and attend to Cambell. The work was tedious. Pete Sinclair was rappelling down as well, where he drilled numerous holes that had to be hand-drilled more than 4 inches into the rock for security bolts to hold the winch through which 300-foot lengths of quarter-inch steel cable were looped to lower the litter. A second system of belay ropes was used for security. The team had trained on this system before, but had never used cable. There were moments of apprehension as the steel jerked as if it were breaking. At one point, Ortenberger and Irvine dropped rocks to gauge if they had enough rope and cable to reach an area known as the grandstand. Although the two were mathematicians and made an algorithm in their heads, it was still an educated guess. But the team had to rely on their calculations or their fellow ranger and Cambell would dangle in the void with no chance of being pulled up. The team traveled an estimated backbreaking 1,100 feet on the first full day of the rescue, but were still a daunting 900 feet from their goal. 2 sleepless nights and most of 3 non-stop days later, that's an average of fewer than 40 feet per hour, they arrived at the 11,000-foot Teton Glacier, where a helicopter awaited to take Gaylord Campbell to the hospital. But it wasn't over. Pete, Mike, and injured Cambell already traversed down to the grandstand. Ralph, Ted, Bob, Rick, and Lee were still on the ledge and had to head down to the grandstand as well, so they spent another night on the ledge while rocks came tumbling down. Cambell and his litter finally landed on the Teton Glacier at 4 p.m. on August 24, 1967. After a 20-minute helicopter ride, he was in St. John's Hospital in Jackson. Wilson and 5 of the other rescuers were still on the face when the helicopter left. None ever heard again from Cambell, who recovered from his injuries. The next morning, the team prepared to traverse the same path no climber has ever attempted. Hours later, each of the team members touched ground on the Grandstand Glacier. One by one, each of the rescuers was picked up by helicopter and flown below to the valley floor. When they placed Cambell in a helicopter, they thought it was over. The rescue was a success. Cambell lived and would go on to a full recovery, and one else was injured in the efforts. In interviews after the ordeal, Cambell criticized the skill and decisions the Rangers made. Almost 50 years later, Cambell remained critical of the men in interviews. Cambell complained little about the pain during the rescue, but often tried to control the rescue from his position on the litter. He showed little appreciation for the efforts of the rescue team and was, in fact, critical of some of the strategies used to save his life. He has ignored all attempts at contact by his rescuers. Cambell's criticisms were rightfully ignored, and the Jenny Lake Rangers found themselves in the center of a media frenzy, with magazines and newspapers wanting interviews for national stories. Pete, Ralph, Ted, Bob, Mike, and Rick were hardly prepared for all the attention. The saga was covered in a number of national publications, whose reporters descended on Jackson. Reader's Digest ran a story titled The Impossible Rescue. Later, early in the summer of 1968, under orders from President Lyndon B. Johnson, the Rangers were flown out to Washington, D.C., as each member of the team was presented a Medal of Valor from Interior Secretary Stuart Udall. Udall coined it as the Immaculate Rescue. Later that same day, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, and the fuss over the rescue quickly died. After that, life took over. The 6 rescue Rangers got college degrees, families, mortgages, and careers. Pete Sinclair became an English professor at Evergreen College in Washington. Bob Irvine, a math professor at Weber State College in Ogden. Mike Ermarth, a history professor at Dartmouth. Ted Wilson, after 3 terms as mayor of Salt Lake, became a political science professor and director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics at the University of Utah. Rick Reese worked in conservation and the Community Affairs Office at the University of Utah. Only Ralph Tingey, after getting a degree at the University of Utah in classical Greek and studying for a PhD at Johns Hopkins in Near Eastern languages, stayed with the Park Service. Having that experience with my mates is something that transcended anything I've experienced in my life, Wilson said. For Reese, it wasn't life-altering or introspective. It was a rare chance to spend 3 days climbing with his best friends in the mountains. On that weekend, 42 years ago, 7 men pulled off a technical rescue that, at the time, was remarkable not only for its technique, but its flawless outcome. The rescue will live in infamy. Mountains pose a variety of dangers, including unpredictable weather, falling rocks, hidden crevasses, and avalanches. For this reason, teamwork is vital for the group to reach its goals safely. Alert proper authorities that you are entering the mountain for an expedition, as well as inform them of the route you wish to take and your expected return date. Having survival skills involves an awareness of your surroundings, an understanding of the dangers you're facing, and the ability to think of ways to escape the threat. When you're in a hazardous situation and don't know what to do, always let your survival instinct take over. And if you find yourself in a situation where rescue is required, please show gratitude to your rescuers. It's not an easy job, and in many situations, they're putting their lives at risk as well. Taking these skills into consideration and practicing them before embarking on a mountaineering excursion will almost guarantee avoiding an outdoor disaster.